Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. We have a great episode for you today. We're going to talk about President Trump and his recent comments exposing Mark Carney. We've been reporting about this at Juno News for over a month now, that there was a plan for Mark Carney to quietly fold to President Trump, quietly fold to the Americans right after the election. It took less than 72 hours for that to happen. Please do me a favor. I'm going to ask you to just quickly like this video. It just takes half a second. It really helps us with the algorithm. We want to get this show discovered by as many Canadians as possible. But before we get to the news, I'm very pleased today to be joined by one of my favorite guests at the Candice Malcolm Show, our friend Andrew Lawton. Andrew is the Member of Parliament-elect for Elgin St. Thomas, London South. Andrew, congratulations and welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. It's good to be back, albeit in a very, very different capacity, but I'm very grateful to be here.
Absolutely. So viewers know, and I'll just quickly recap their memory. Andrew is a longtime journalist. He was a radio host in London, Ontario. And then when he left the legacy media, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we hired him. We scooped him up at True North, and he moved his radio show over to our airways. And he was a longtime mainstay for True North. And sadly, we lost Andrew Lawton because he decided to abandon the independent media and join the Conservatives. We're very happy for you, Andrew, and he just recently was elected. So, Andrew, why don't you walk us through your journey? Tell us about what it's like to go from being on this side of the interview to the other side, and how the campaigning went out in London.
Well, let me say, I haven't abandoned independent media. I'm still a strong supporter and a strong ally, and I'm happy to be here and will continue to support independent journalism. But my goodness, when the challenge of my role at True North as managing editor and host of my show was that I was on the front lines of a lot of the challenges facing this country for so long. And I was talking about just the decline and the hardship. And I had interviewed Pierre Poilievre and I'd reported on the Liberals and Mark Carney and all of that. And, when time was coming up to where the election was, we thought was going to be, I felt I could not spend this election on the sidelines. The stakes were just too high, and I decided to. There was a longtime Conservative member of Parliament in a local riding that was not running again, and I really thought long and hard about it. I prayed about it, and reluctantly talked to you about it. And knowing you would be as you were, very encouraging, but also at the same time, I think probably secretly hoping I might lose so that I could stay at True North. But you know what? I was so grateful for the support of not just you and our team, but all of the audience as well. A ton of whom I learned were right there in the riding, and we're so excited that they now had the opportunity to cast a ballot for me. And we fought really hard for the nomination, and then I became the candidate in November, and for the last what is it, five months now, we've been plugging away day in, day out, and we're really honored with the victory we had with over 50% of the vote on Monday night.
Wow, congratulations. And so, like, was it what you expected? Or how are you feeling post-election? Disappointed, excited? What's it like at this point?
It's funny you mentioned that. It was a bit bittersweet because we were so focused on our local riding and our campaign, and that was the only thing. And you really, like, when you're out knocking on doors, as I was from morning to night, you're not even really following the national story. So it took, like, I had to take time each evening to catch up on what was happening with Pierre here and Mark Carney there, because that wasn't what we were dealing with on the ground. And then at the end of it, we win and we're so excited and we're over the moon. And you have to take that moment and say, oh, wow, but yeah, we're actually disappointed too, because nationally things didn't go the way they were supposed to. And the next day, so on Tuesday of this week, we were at the campaign office, just, closing up loose ends and collecting signs and all of this stuff. And people were coming into the office, and I was expecting everyone to be all excited. And they're like, oh, this sucks. And I was like, well, no, it doesn't entirely, but I understand it. So it was a bit of a bittersweet moment, but the challenges that propelled me into politics are still there. And, I can use my voice now, not, doing a show, but in the House of Commons, holding the government to account and championing the very things that I ran on in the platform. And I'm very honored to have that opportunity to advocate for those values and advocate for my constituents.
I think there's a lot of silver lining to the election. Of course, disappointing that Pierre Poilievre didn't become prime minister. I think that's what so many people hoped and expected. But obviously, the Conservatives doing so well in Ontario, increasing the popular vote up to 41%. Unbelievable that 41% isn't enough to get to a majority in Canada anymore. And I just want to know, like, what's in store next? When do you get sworn in to be an MP? A lot of people are asking questions around Pierre Poilievre, and we'll get to some of the media reports about his future. I presume he's staying on as leader. What will happen though with him not having a seat in the Parliament?
So as for the timeline for me, I don't know. I'm learning a lot about this process. I'd obviously thought about what's going to happen when I'm in Parliament, but I hadn't really thought of that period between the election and there. I've already had some onboarding from the House of Commons, which has been really interesting, and I'm doing some orientation in Ottawa next week. And I think that it sounds like Parliament could be coming back pretty soon. So I don't know, but rest assured, if people follow me on social media, I'll have all the information about when the swearing in is happening. As far as Pierre goes, I think he should be tremendously proud of what he did. He not just ran a campaign that attracted, as you mentioned, 41% of the national popular vote, but that number is important because that's higher than the Conservatives got even when we won a majority government in 2011 with Stephen Harper. The issue was not the number of votes. The issue is that under the first past the post system, the distribution can sometimes be a little bit messy. And what we saw this election was a surge in Conservative support, but a complete collapse of the NDP voice and vote. And that's very difficult to compete with if you have the NDP vote coalescing behind the Liberals, which happened in a number of ridings. Now, I'm not saying there's anything unfair about that. That's the democratic process. And I think it's a byproduct of the NDP being such a weak, non-existent political force over the last few years. If you're an NDP voter and you're looking at your party just propping up the Liberals blindly in exchange for nothing, you're saying, all right, well, I guess, why have the middleman? Why not just vote Liberal? And I think that's what a lot of New Democrats did. But conversely, a lot of New Democrat voters came to the Conservatives. We saw success in ridings that have oftentimes been NDP strongholds in my own city, in London Fanshawe, one riding there that the Conservatives have held once in its history, and I think that was in '84 when Mulroney had that massive majority. We had a sweep of Windsor. We picked up in Hamilton. So these are areas that show that Pierre Poilievre has expanded the Conservative base, which is what we always talk about as being necessary for a long-term victory. So I think there's a lot to be proud of, and Pierre will continue to lead this party.
It's so interesting because there are some demographics, like all those union endorsements really help
Mhm.
Poilievre. As you mentioned, with working class towns, also young Canadians, like young voters really showed up for Pierre in a way that I haven't seen happen for Conservatives in a long time, and new Canadians as well. There was a lot of, like, a riding like Markhamville, or Unionville, Markham, went for the Conservatives, which is very interesting. All of Richmond Hill as well. Okay, Andrew, I want to get to the news because this, I think, to so many Canadians who did not want Mark Carney to win, is so frustrating because this idea that the media narrative created from very early on that President Trump was this existential threat to Canada and that Mark Carney was the man with the plan and he was the one that could combat Donald Trump. I think so many Liberal voters believe that, and so many of them had that idea in their head. Well, it took less than 72 hours, from my perspective, for this illusion to just completely evaporate. And President Trump on Wednesday came out again with the 51st state rhetoric, with the just provocative statements about Canada. And I think he exposed Mark Carney for being two-faced because, again, Mark Carney, even in his election victory speech, even after the campaign was over, he doubled down on his anti-Americanism. He said in that speech that our relationship with the United States is over, which is so dramatic. And here is President Trump speaking glowingly about Mark Carney, saying that Mark Carney called him up and said, let's make a deal, and basically saying that he thinks that Pierre Poilievre was harder on him than Mark Carney. This is all just totally in direct contradiction to the media narrative. So let's play this clip of President Trump in the Oval Office yesterday.
President, as Prime Minister of Canada ran against, not only against the Conservatives, but also against you. Yesterday, yesterday he spoke about American betrayal. Are you interested in rebuilding relations with Canada, and if so, how?
No, well, I think we're going to have a great relationship. He called me up yesterday. He said, "Let's make a deal." He was running for office. They both hated Trump, and it was the one that hated Trump, I think, the least that won. I actually think the Conservative hated me much more than the so-called liberal. He's a pretty liberal guy. But no, I spoke to him yesterday. Couldn't have been nicer, and I congratulated him. It was a very mixed signal because it's almost even, which makes it very complicated for the country. It's a pretty tight race. but he's a very nice gentleman, and he's going to come to the White House very shortly.
To me, this shows that Mark Carney is two-faced because to his Canadian audience, he does the whole elbows up bit. He says our relationship is over, and he has very harsh words for the Americans. And then according to Trump's retelling of it, I have no reason to believe that Trump isn't being honest there. He's a very nice gentleman. He's very nice. He thinks that the conservative dislikes him more, which means that what Pierre Poilievre was doing in public is presumably also what's happening in private, whereas for Mark Carney, in public, he's very harsh to Trump. In private, he's kissing the ring and being, reconciliatory. What do you think of all this, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, the Liberals were trying to stoke the very worst fear of what the U.S. was going to do to Canada. And look, I think the U.S. threats needed to be taken seriously, and I think they were. I think tariffs on their own are incredibly unjust. They're unjustified. They're wrong. They hurt both countries. They put, in my riding especially, a lot of agriculture and manufacturing. It threw a lot of that into jeopardy and peril. So threats did need to be taken seriously, but the Liberals were trying to stoke the very worst. They were trying to say, that they were trying to make all of these claims that weren't supported by anything between the Canadian Conservatives and the Trump administration. And in the end, when Trump was speaking very candidly throughout the campaign about how he'd prefer the Liberal, what I and others had said is that he prefers weak leadership. He knew that either a weakened Canada would be better for the U.S., or he knew that Mark Carney was going to suck up and kiss the ring. I mean, we still do not know what Mark Carney's business dealings are. He has never disclosed these things publicly. We don't know where his money is tied up. We don't even know if he has business dealings with Donald Trump. I mean, we actually have no idea. And the reality is, this was not some game of 3D chess on Trump's part. He was very clear that he wanted Mark Carney in there, and I think we're seeing this.
Well, you mentioned blind trust. Interesting news today. Brookfield Asset Management announced that they are reinvesting and investing in U.S. manufacturing. So this came out on Bloomberg. I'll read from it quickly. Brookfield Infrastructure Partner LP is looking to invest in U.S. manufacturing operations as companies plan to build new plants following President Trump's tariff plans. Brookfield is looking at providing capital to companies that are planning to bring new manufacturing back to the country, similar to the firm's $30 billion deal with Intel. So not only is Mark Carney out there, trying to make a deal with President Trump now the election's over, his company is also doing the thing that Trump wants to do. So from my perspective, it seems like Trump is winning this trade war.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I think, the theme of this election for a lot of people was who's going to put Canada first. And Mark Carney has not demonstrated a willingness to do that. And I'm not exactly optimistic, having seen how the first few days after the election are shaking out.
Okay, Andrew, I want to switch gears a little bit. I caught this on CBC on election night, and here is Rosemary Barton speaking on an election panel, and she's talking about how she's been speaking to many conservatives who say that they want Pierre Poilievre to step aside or that it's time to have a leadership review. Look, I talk to a lot of conservatives as well, and I am not hearing this at all. So maybe Rosemary Barton has more conservative friends than I do. I kind of doubt it, but I want to play this clip. You can see former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney pushing back against it, but let's play this clip.
He was definitely laying the groundwork that he has no intention of leaving, and he was pointing to the proof points as to why he deserves to stay and continue this fight. And I know you think that he will. I do know people who are already gearing up to try and push him out. We'll see what happens.
Well, I know a lot of conservatives in Canada, and I haven't heard that from anybody. Not to say they don't exist.
Well, they exist. I don't know if they tell you, but they told me.
So Rosemary Barton claiming to know more conservatives than Jason Kenney, than myself and others. Look, I know that there was a bit of a campaign to undermine Pierre Poilievre during the election. That has all come out with the PCs, with Corey Tenike, who is Doug Ford's chief of staff or campaign manager, Doug Ford himself. There's been a bit of a back and forth. Also, Tim Houston, the premier of Nova Scotia. I don't understand why, but he started putting out campaign videos promoting himself right at the end of the election, which just seems so wildly inappropriate to me. So I know that there are some people in the orbit that are looking to take Pierre Poilievre's job, presumably. But as far as the grassroots and the base and conservative partisans and members, this is not something that I'm hearing. So I'm wondering if you can react to all that.
Yeah, look, I don't really care what Doug Ford is saying about, the conservative leader. People who are actually conservative are behind Pierre Poilievre and appreciate and understand what he's done. And when I wrote my biography of Pierre, before I knew I'd be jumping into politics, one of the points that I said there was that Pierre was leading a movement, not just a party. And I think even with the unsuccessful outcome on election night, we saw that. We saw that in the rallies. We saw that in the demographics shifting towards the Conservatives. We saw it in young people who are traditionally very difficult to get engaged in politics and very difficult to get out to vote. And, when I was out knocking on doors, areas that we did really well in the previous election in my riding we were still finding support there, but areas we didn't do well in last time, we were finding a ton of support in because we were appealing to a demographic that historically had not been voting or had not been voting Conservative. And I think that itself is really, really key, and it gives us something to build on moving forward. But there are people that have their own ambitions and ulterior motives that are going to undermine Pierre, not because they think it's in the best interests of the party, but because they think it's in their own best interests.
Well, I just don't see the constituency behind that. I think you're right that it's not just a political party, it is a movement. People are very invested in Pierre Poilievre. The excitement around him has been there since he first declared leader. And I would say years before that, like I had him on my show in 2020, 2021, and they were always really popular episodes. Like people in the audience, people in the Conservative base really are inspired by Pierre Poilievre. So I just don't see it coming. I think the media is trying to promote it, and maybe some circles, like people in the Ontario PC party, which I don't understand. I think it's funny. And first of all, I think it's great to see someone like Jamil Javani able to speak freely. We showed the clip of him yesterday, but he was out there on election night just kind of finally just saying that we're not happy with what Doug Ford did. He posted this hilarious meme on X, which I think, a lot of the elite establishment people were very angry at him for posting this meme. I just thought, it is just funny. We have more and more millennials in public office, and they're kind of making light of things like this. And so you can see Doug Ford ripping off an Ontario PC shirt and having a Liberal shirt underneath, looking like an old style wrestler. But Doug Ford himself came out and addressed this. So he was speaking to reporters in Mississauga yesterday, and here's what he said about the spat with Pierre Poilievre.
Why didn't you come out with Pierre Poilievre and make these kinds of statements during the campaign?
I shouldn't interfere in the federal election. Last time I checked, Pierre Poilievre never came out in our election. Matter of fact, him or one of his lieutenants told every one of his members, "Don't you dare go out and help the PCs." Isn't that ironic?
So I don't know if it's just like an interpersonal spat or if they have some kind of maybe they're both wanting the same job. I don't know why Doug Ford is continuing this. But I know Andrew Scheer, former Conservative leader and Conservative MP, was out there as well. He was speaking on CTV's show with Dassi Capellos, and here's what he had to say.
Tim Houston said the Conservatives are pushing more people away than pulling in. These are Conservatives. This isn't me just making it up.
It's just demonstrably false by the facts. I mean, the facts are it doesn't make sense.
Why didn't Pierre Poilievre talk to Tim Houston or talk to Doug Ford? Isn't that weird?
You can't simultaneously say we push people away when we got more votes. That's just factually incorrect. That doesn't work on a mathematical level. I don't know what else to say. I mean, we got more votes, we got a higher percentage, we won more seats. Clearly, we weren't pushing people away. We reached historic highs. That's just a nonsensical statement that doesn't hold up to a second's worth of scrutiny.
So is this Conservative infighting a problem, or do you think that this is just like a couple of people with big egos who wanted the top job and saw this as their opportunity, and then someone like Andrew Scheer just saying, the facts don't show that Pierre Poilievre actually had a huge loss. The facts show that our strategy is working and we should continue. Do you think Conservative infighting is a problem?
Look, I think people who are invested in the Conservative movement and invested in the Conservative Party of Canada's success understand what we achieved in the last election, and while disappointed, understand that we have a mandate to hold the government to account and continue. This is not a moment in which we have to rebuild. This is a moment in which we have to just keep forging ahead and continuing to grow and get our message out. And, look, I go into this as someone honored to be a member of Parliament in the next Parliament. I would have loved to have been doing that in government. But, my role is just as important in opposition, if that's where the chips have fallen, to hold the government to account. And look, I don't know how long the next parliament is going to last, but I do know that Mark Carney has given every indication that he is going to actually be worse than Justin Trudeau for the economy. he was parading himself around as this, fiscally responsible centrist, but then he put his platform out in the 11th hour of the campaign that called for $250 billion more in spending over the next 4 years than Justin Trudeau, who never met a tax hike and spending increase he didn't like, than he had planned in the fall economic update. So I think Canadians will see very quickly that we could not afford to give the Liberals a fourth term.
Okay, I want to move on to the next topic here for you, Andrew. Just quickly get your thoughts on this. So we saw Premier in Alberta, Danielle Smith, come out and say, first of all, that she wanted a reset in relations, laying out a whole bunch of ground rules for what she thinks the new relationship between the feds and Alberta should look like. Simultaneously, she changed the Citizens Initiative Act to lower the threshold that would trigger a referendum. We had constitutional lawyer Keith Wilson joined the show yesterday and lay it all out for us. Really interesting development. Well, what do you say to the Canadians, and specifically folks in Alberta, who are just so disappointed and so dismayed with the election results that they've lost faith in the system and they are interested, or at least flirting with, this idea of Alberta sovereignty and independence?
I'll be perfectly candid. I haven't followed a lot of this. I've only seen the headlines, but generally speaking, I love this country and I believe in this country. And I think this country has room for all of the different geographic areas, all of the different political groups and factions that we have. And we need to stand up for Canada. And I think that if people feel alienated, it's because the federal government has either taken them for granted or actively rejected them. And I am not going to give up on Canada, and I don't want anyone else to either.
Well, that's very well put. And obviously, we will continue to follow those developments. Hopefully, it doesn't come to that. Hopefully, this parliament is short-lived and the Conservatives can figure out a way to gain power in Ottawa so that it doesn't come to this. But very interesting. Appreciate your time today, Andrew. Great to have you back on the show. Don't be a stranger. And we wish you all the best in your next endeavor in Ottawa.
Thanks very much, Candice, and everyone. It's great to be back.
All right, that's Andrew Lawton, MP-elect in the riding of Elgin, St. Thomas, London South. Great to have him on the show. All right, folks, that's all the time we have for today. We'll be back again tomorrow with all the news. Thank you so much. I'm Candice Malcolm. This is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you, and God bless.
You're watching Juno News, Canada's fastest growing independent news network. Our team works day and night to bring you nationwide coverage of the issues that matter. Honest reporting of the stories that put Canadians first. From far and wide, Juno is doing the work to turn the dial in the right direction, bringing you the news from the field and in the studio. Wherever it takes us, we get the job done. For you, for Canada. Subscribe today and help us replace the CBC. Go to junonews.com to join the fight.